Good evening, Vice Mayor, members of the City Council. Thank you for the opportunity to speak tonight. I've had a chance to meet with a few of you, but unfortunately, due to the tight timetable of this appeal, I haven't had the chance to meet with all of you. I hope that the emails that have been sent have assisted in informing you about this very complex issue. And make no mistake, it is complex. I hope the presentation will address these issues in a simple and comprehensive manner. The flash drive that I provided includes the following documents related to the appeal. Most of them were produced by the City of Sacramento, as you can see here. Some of them have already been sent. Others are new and being provided to be part of the public record. Now, the basis of the appeal. Midtown residents want a strong, stable neighborhood. The city's decision to approve Yamanee weakens and destabilizes our neighborhood. The decision of staff to recommend support to the Yamanee project and the decision to approve Yamanee by the Planning Commission was arbitrary, unfair, and destructive. The use of a deviation that has become a loophole that allows unlimited development in nearly any part of the city, regardless of zoning code. We're asking for a project that fits the general plan, either at the current site or for the city to facilitate building this project downtown in the central core, not in a central city neighborhood intended for lower building intensities. The images on the next few slides are the type of buildings that you'd see in Midtown's commercial corridors. Small multi-story office buildings, commercial storefronts appended on previously residential buildings, and buildings of widely varying scales and ages. There's also a strong residential presence on these commercial streets, including multifamily and single-family homes and many architectural landmarks. However, I should explain that none of these buildings are in Midtown. They were located in a neighborhood called the West End, roughly where Capitol Mall is today. None of them still exist. The West End was a neighborhood entirely demolished by redevelopment in the 1950s, the state of California's capital area plan in the 60s, and federal highway projects like Interstate 5. This redevelopment plan was a result of what was called the businessman's version of redevelopment that allowed displacement of neighborhoods without providing replacement homes. The plan was formulated with the enthusiastic support of the Chamber of Commerce and the City of Sacramento. City residents voted against it, but it was moved forward anyhow. Less than a dozen buildings in this neighborhood survive. The West End was a densely populated, mixed-use neighborhood at the heart of downtown Sacramento. This was a vibrant part of our urban core, including a predominantly African-American and Japanese-American business district. This was Sacramento's Midtown in the 1950s, home to many of Sacramento's most legendary nightlife establishments, like the Zanzibar Club. It's all gone now. The redevelopment era's efforts of the 50s and 60s were intended to push eastward until reaching Alhambra Boulevard, retaining only a handful of the most architecturally significant buildings, ringed by highways and converted to superblocks connected by high-speed arterials. The result of these efforts was a dramatic depopulation of downtown Sacramento. This shows the census tracts of downtown and midtown Sacramento in 1950, a total population of 58,000 people. By 1970, that number had been reduced by redevelopment to 28,000 people, with the downtown core itself almost entirely depopulated. This is as of 2010, when we had a population of 30,000 people. And you can see that 3 of those census tracts were combined into one because there simply weren't enough people left. Midtown has recovered somewhat, downtown has not. And if you don't count the residents of the main jail, there's 1/3 the population density of Midtown in downtown. Now, redevelopment's legacy was intended to convert the central city to an employment zone, replacing residential neighborhoods with commercial and highways to let workers reach downtown quickly and leave just as quickly. This aerial photo from 1973 shows the priority for the central city on parking lots. Almost all of them are gone now today. It's a very different downtown as we see. In 1965, Sacramento started its first general plan, still very much based on redevelopment philosophy of high-rise commercial zoning along business corridors. Midtown was zoned for high-density residential and high-rise commercial, aside from a few small areas on the outer perimeter. This was still top-down development, disconnected from community participation. The architectural legacy of this era of Midtown includes the handful of mid-rise senior housing and public housing buildings located in Midtown, such as the one across from the project site, and the nearly ubiquitous 2 to 3 story dingbat or mansard roofed apartments. From the 1988 General Plan of the City of Sacramento. Since the 1965 General Plan, new goals and priorities have emerged to cause a need to reevaluate the desirable development form for the area. This change came because a generation of young people began a return to the central city in the 1970s. This included young professionals disinterested in a long commute to the suburbs, students seeking an inexpensive and sociable lifestyle, and the emergence of Lavender Heights as a haven of inclusiveness and tolerance within the central city. The existing residents of the central city, community communities of color, those not displaced by redevelopment, had learned how to organize and advocate for their own rights and the rights of their communities. The new arrivals took these lessons to heart, forming strong community organizations that worked together to protect their neighborhoods. This was the turning point. Unlike the 60s redevelopment plan, the 1988 general plan and 1990 Central City Comprehensive Plan were developed via community input and civic participation, bringing together city government, developers, and community residents. High-rise and high-density uses were focused into the central business district with stronger protection for residents and existing neighborhoods in the newly created historic districts and the first elements of mixed use. Now, the 2030 general plan was the process of 5 years. The purpose of a general plan is to limit ambiguity regarding planning decisions, both for developers and for neighborhoods, and to provide an equitable basis for planning decisions. The 2030 general plan took 5 years, including extensive public outreach and broad stakeholder development. The 2030 general plan was updated last year in 2015, March 3rd. This is no outdated document. This isn't a regulation against spanking your mule on a public street on Sunday. This was approved last year, and it's a very aggressive plan. In 2013, we added the shift from the zoning code to the planning and development code that included dramatic reductions in parking requirements. These changes removed unnecessary hurdles to development of housing in the central city, such as allowing residential development by right into the C2 zone, which previously required a special permit. It also planned a maximum population of the central city by 2035 of 109,000. That's 3 times as many as today. This is not a mild plan, but a very aggressive one. We can achieve that following the current general plan guidelines and without creating special exceptions. Now, this is the central city's urban form map. You can see the orange areas are residential, traditional neighborhood medium, up to 35 units an acre. The pink corridors along business streets are urban corridor low and high. East of 19th, it's urban corridor low, generally about 6 stories. This is the zone that Yamanee is located. Urban corridor high is 8 stories and 150 units an acre. The bright red is urban center, 250 units and 24 stories, while the dark red is the central business district, up to 450 units an acre, unlimited heights. These are the high-rise zones of Sacramento. The Central Community Plan was derived from the general plan. You can see there are several distinct areas: the River District, the rail yards, which is now being updated, the Central Core Design Guidelines, and the Central City Neighborhood Guidelines. High-rise residential is critical in the Central Core because it's so depopulated but so filled with offices, there are very few building sites. You need high-rise residential in the downtown urban core. And the reason why it fits is because of the current built environment. These images of J Street and one of K Street show the urban form of downtown. The buildings are vertical, both historic and recent, with dramatic changes in building height. The highest densities and tallest buildings are located in this zone. High-rise residential is critical here. The background document that formed the general plan's land use category specifically called out J Street as an archetypal urban form, traditional pedestrian-oriented commercial corridor. J Street in Midtown is still urban, still dense, as I said, more dense than downtown, but in a different form. The buildings are 2 to 3 stories for the most part, with exceptions like the legacy buildings from the previous general plan era. But there's still a lot of room to grow. Joe Yee, the architect who served as the chairman of the 2030 General Plan Advisory Committee, said at the meeting regarding Yamanee, he's a member of the Planning Commission, that 6 stories was considered a huge increase in intensity in this area, the most you could get in these corridors without destroying the neighborhood as part of the 2030 General Plan. Mr. Yee was also one of the dissenting votes of the Planning Commission's decision, citing his experience with the formation of the General Plan and their analysis of Midtown, an existing, thriving neighborhood. But there is room to grow, as we've seen. These are just a few examples of recently completed and successful infill projects in the central city. They were all built in urban corridor low zones or the R Street corridor, all within the general plan envelope, and they include for-sale housing and, importantly, a significant amount of affordable housing. The R Street Corridors community plan was championed by residents in favor of a high-rise approach favored by developers in the city. The current success stories on R Street affirm the victory of citizen participation in urban planning over top-down development. And it hasn't ended yet. This is just part of about 2,000 new housing units in the development pipeline, either recently approved or under construction, not counting anything in the rail yards or Township 9 or Central City adjacent projects like the Mill on Broadway. As a result, the Central City is one of only 2 Sacramento community plan areas that has exceeded the 2020 housing forecast. Unlike the first decade of the 21st century, when only about 10% of new housing in Sacramento was built in the Central City, the rest mostly in Natomas, an enormous shift has occurred. Since 2010, about 2/3 of all new housing constructed in the entire city of Sacramento was built in the Central City. Almost 1,400 homes in 4 square miles of a 98 square mile city. Construction may be at a standstill elsewhere, but the new building taking place represents the latest phase of the cultural renaissance begun in the 70s as a 3rd generation of young people discover Midtown and make it their own. According to the planning documents submitted with this project, the population of the Central City has already risen from 30,000 in 2010 to 32,000 by 2014, but 1/3 of the new housing has been built since then. So we can safely assume there's about 33,000 people in the Central City. The last time that many people lived in the Central City, there were still hot rods cruising down K Street. Now let's look at the block of the Yamanee site. This is the 2500 block of J Street. The buildings in gray are the existing buildings on the south side of the street. The green line is the senior facility. You can see it's about 100 feet tall. This is how the block would look if it was built out with several buildings at the maximum zoned height of about 78 feet. So you can see it's a significant increase to what's already there, but it is permitted. This is Yamanee. Now, Yamanee is allowed because of what's called a deviation. Before the advent of deviation, going beyond zoning limits required rezoning or a variance, and that required the owner to show some sort of hardship caused by the site that would prevent a use that would otherwise be permitted. Granting a variance without a hardship violates state law. Deviation effectively has become a de facto variance if the project presented a significant community benefit. It is a loophole, and I call it that because it does not require that the city quantify the benefit in objective terms. There are no standards for specific community benefits. In other cities where this is used, there are specific deviations allowed in return for specific benefits. In this case, it is a general deviation. There's no minimum and no maximum amount that can be demanded. This is how the block looks right now. And this is how the building would look. And you can see that it's not comparable in scale to the 9-story building across the street. It dwarfs it. The 9-story building is about 40 feet deep. This building is 160 feet deep. It actually wouldn't be allowed in the Central City because the 25th Street side is too wide. What they're asking for is 178 feet, 100 feet over the limit, 3 times the density. This is an exceptional deviation, not a minor deviation. Out of 1,500 entitlements approved since the Planning and Development Code, less than 50 deviations have been asked for, only 2 for height, and the highest one up till now was 12 feet. This asks for 100. Now, there is no environmental impact report for this project. The City of Sacramento instead performed a level of environmental review called the Sustainable Communities Environmental Assessment, which is the equivalent of a mitigated negative declaration, according to the city's own staff report. The SCEA is new and intended for infill projects adjacent to transit. Yamanee is next to a high-frequency bus route and is an infill project, but they can't be granted just because it's near a bus route. There are several conditions that must be met to use an SCEA. One of those requirements, the project has to be consistent with the city's general plan for zoning. Yamanee clearly doesn't fit the current zoning as it is. They had to ask for the deviation essentially to say, we're going to make the rule this tall instead of the 65 feet. And the city's contention is because the project is consistent with some aspects of the general plan, they can grant the deviation. City staff has used this as a loophole to avoid completion of a full environmental impact report. Unlike an EIR, the SCEA doesn't have to consider aesthetics, massing, and height, project alternatives, or alternative locations. These can all be excluded. That's how a significant and unavoidable impact, as it is listed in the SCEA, can be completely ignored in the environmental review that's being done. Now, Whole Foods was the exception, the second largest deviation. It asked for 12 additional feet. And It's about 5 blocks from Yamanee. It's on the same bus route. With the same land use category and zoning. It also included residential apartments and below-grade parking with ground floor retail. This developer requested a deviation, but unlike Yamanee, they completed a full EIR and also amended the general plan to rezone the project site. Why wasn't Yamanee, as twice as tall, required to do an EIR or amend the general plan to rezone for what this use really is, a C3 central business district type use? In part because it would have identified the key issues that aren't considered by an SCEA. There are also conditions that disqualify a project from using an SCEA, including the known presence of significant and unavoidable impacts. It can be fairly argued that the SCEA is inappropriate because of the analysis that demonstrates that the Table 1 of 24 in the SCEA says that the building height is a significant and unavoidable impact. Thus, there's enough evidence to fairly argue that the exemption isn't valid and a full EIR is necessary to consider the aesthetic, land use, utility, wind, water, and shadow impacts. This is the opposite of how cities are supposed to do environmental review. Environmental review is supposed to err on the side of caution, on the side of more thorough environmental analysis. In this case, a known impact was ignored in order to use the SCEA. Now, the community benefits that are presented are all either something that any project would still deliver, or they're aspects of the site. Design is very much a sense of personal aesthetics, but it's perfectly possible, if you look at new construction, it's perfectly possible to design a beautiful building that's less than 6 stories tall. This is a project that's coming through the pipeline, the press building at 21st and Q Street, and this was staff's recommendation for the style of building that met aesthetics. Homeownership opportunities present a problem. There is no way to require that a developer make a project for sale. They can put it up as for sale in the development process and then change their mind and rent it. This is a Lexington Midtown, ironically located on Alhambra Boulevard just outside of Midtown. And it was presented through the development process as for sale condominium housing. Once it was built, they were rented as apartments. They're still apartments 10 years later. Now, Yamanee is unique in one aspect, in that it would be the only example of high-rise condominium for-sale housing in Midtown because Midtown isn't zoned for high-rise.
Mr. Burke, I just want to get a time check so that I can be clear on.
We will be done in 10 minutes. I apologize for the time, but there are a lot of issues, and we're...
Yeah, and I know. I just want to make sure we're on the same time.
Understood.
Line.
Thank you. The community benefits of infill are inherent to the site. Anything built in the central city is infill. Sustainability, anything that's built in California has to follow Title 24, the State Building Code for Energy Efficiency. It is a non-negotiable state law that any project is required to follow. Any building built in California has to follow this very high standard for energy efficiency. LEED Platinum doesn't require a 15-story building either. This is 16 Powerhouse, built within the general plan envelope. It would fit perfectly at 25th and J Street. It is a LEED Platinum certified building. Decreased dependency on cars is another inherent aspect of the project location. Any building, any residential building that would build there, the residents would not need cars as much. But this is for sale housing priced at $750,000 on up, which means how many people in this price point are realistically going to go car free and take the bus? Alley activation. This is the alley side of the building, and you can see the main use of the alley is for the entrance and exits of cars. Next to it is a smud vault and then a window for one of the retail stores. That's the extent of alley activation here. But again, it's something that any project at the site could do equally well. There is the pass-through on the edge of the building. There's a 10-foot paseo. It's actually completely covered by the building, so it'll never see sunlight, and that's an alternate way to get to the alley. But that kind of raised a question for us. Why is that pass through there? Why did they choose to put a 10-foot unsunlight corridor? And we thought maybe it was to separate the edge of the building far enough from the adjacent building to allow windows. Because if you build a building to the property line, this is under California Building Code, you can't put windows on it, or you have to have non-openable 2-hour fire-rated windows. The other confusion is that if you actually look at the building, the cantilever that moves the building wall above that 10-foot gap actually brings the building to the building wall. And California, like I said, California Building Code prohibits windows on that sort of a wall, which means all of these windows can't be built. The project as presented cannot be built according to California Building Code. This is a long list of concerns. I'm not going to go into detail on those, but I'm just going to read one chapter. This violates zoning uniformity. The staff report says this project isn't appropriate for all parts of Midtown. The city's granting an extreme exception to zoning rules of 65 feet in a C2 zone, creating a special exception for a single property owner, creating a precedent that the city can zone by exception or on an ad hoc basis rather than by established, predictable, and uniform standards. The city's applying zoning in an ad hoc manner by allowing a project grossly out of scale with the surrounding uses. This is also known as spot zoning, a de facto variance. Zoning rests upon a critical reciprocity in which each landowner gives up some rights in exchange for the assurance that his or her neighbors will be similarly restricted in order to enhance the overall community welfare. The uniformity requirement is like the enforcement clause in a contract that's intended to prevent unreasonable discrimination against or benefit to particular properties within a given zone. By approving an ad hoc exception for a particular property, the city is breaking that contract. The project risks are shown with this map. Now, we already mentioned that this is urban corridor low, 6 stories maximum. This de facto rezone creates a spot of Central City, C3, Central Business District, that can then be expanded because this door has been opened. It's very difficult legally to close. Any future developer can say, well, you made an exception for this project. Now I want to do the same thing. This creates an ambiguity about the true value of the land. Is this land that can be sold for 6-story buildings or for 15-story buildings? And if it can be sold for 15-story buildings, it's worth more. That means that 6-story projects no longer pencil. And the 15-story or higher project are more likely to, so the process of land assembly begins. People buy properties not to utilize those buildings, but in order to re-entitle them for new projects, and the buildings sit vacant. That has a severely dangerous effect on neighborhoods, and that effect can spread. Now, this is great if you happen to be a flipper. It's great if you happen to be an investor in property. It's not so great for a neighborhood. The project risks can be seen on the 1000 block of J Street. This lot at the corner of 10th and J was entitled for a 40-story condominium more than a decade ago. It's been sitting vacant. The building that you see here was demolished last year after a fire, and we're still waiting for this project to come forth. So this is happening in the downtown core. It's also happening in Midtown. This site was approved for a mid-rise apartment building. The developer ran out of money. Now he's trying to sell the buildings with the entitlement for, I think, more than he bought them for, even though the building on the right caught fire over the summer, and actually the building in the middle of this shot caught fire last night. Don't try to say that this can't happen or it's unlikely to happen. It's happening now, and this is likely to make the process worse. There are risks in the rail yards. I talked a little bit about fee districts. It's an important issue that really hasn't been addressed. It hasn't been addressed by staff. It hasn't been mentioned in our community, and every time I mention it, I get told that it's not an issue or we're rethinking this. The fee districts are recalculated every year, but these are fees that are charged above and beyond development fees in the Central Business District, the Richards Boulevard area, and the rail yards. And these are used to pay for infrastructure. Represented in 1997 dollars, according to the Nexus study that was done, about $500 million worth of potential fees. There's a legal risk because these fee districts, the nexus between the fees and the districts was based on the idea that this is where the highest intensity building is done. If downtown developers make the case that, well, you can build a 15-story building in Midtown, that breaks the legal nexus for these fees, so why should we have to pay them? That cuts seriously into city budgets to be able to pay for infrastructure. The project alternatives that we recommend is limit the height to 6 stories on the site, or build it downtown. The idea of the rail yards was mentioned, but Councilmember Harris, I agree, the rail yards aren't ready yet. But as we've heard, downtown is cracking, and downtown is ready for a building like this, and downtown needs this building.
Burg, can you wrap it up for me, please? Can you wrap it up for me, please?
Certainly. This is my summary slide. The project does not demonstrate a significant community benefit. Deviations uses a loophole that grants unlimited authority, and the project is not consistent with the general plan or with zoning. Downtown is ready. Let's deliver on that promise. And the only thing taller than Yamanee is the list of people who oppose it. Would everybody who has joined me in this appeal and opposes this project please stand up or raise your hand?